Thank you, everyone. It's a real honor, a real pleasure to be here at Reed. I've heard so much about this place, so many good things, so it's just it's a real pleasure. So, as Chester mentioned, I come here after spending some time at FiveThirtyEight. I was the quantitative editor, which is a weird title, I know. It's something I'll get into in my talk. And I was a writer there for 3 years, but now I'm a freelance journalist and data scientist, and there's my website. But the title of my talk is, the 6 types of data stories, data journalism stories. But really, they all boil down to one thing. And I'm only going to be talking about Donald Trump. I'm kidding, of course. I would not put myself or any of you through that for the next hour. No, I do want to talk about data journalism and data storytelling because that's my motivation. I believe the principles of good data journalism are very similar, if not identical, to the principles of good data storytelling. Now, I'm not an expert in storytelling, and what I want to do before you, the Reed audience, is to drive home a further point, which is that data journalism and data storytelling ties in perfectly with the liberal arts. And give me a second to kind of make that argument, because I had a liberal arts education. I'm a strong believer in a liberal arts education. And the core of it, I believe, is critiquing and constructing arguments, primarily over text and through discussion. And that's not going away, and a liberal arts education should be rooted in the humanities and the social sciences and history and so on. But there's an added dimension to that discourse, and it's critiquing and constructing and critiquing arguments about empirical observations in the world. And that's a crucial element to a liberal arts education. And to have the tools to make those empirical arguments, you need to know how to write, you need to know how to have some felicity with data. So that's why I believe this is apropos for Reed, and I hope that you understand my motivation is to no matter who you are, if you're an R coder through the R user group, if you're a student here at Reed, a faculty member, I hope you can take away some of these principles. So what do I mean by data journalism? I had someone ask me this earlier today, how do you define data journalism? I have a kind of flippant, somewhat pretentious way that I picked up, I think, at FiveThirtyEight. A lot of us would say data journalism is empirical social science on deadline. What do I mean by that? Well, we're not academic social scientists. We don't pretend to be. The peer review and the kind of rigorous training that you go through is not comparable to what a data journalist does. It's much more sophisticated. But the aim, the value proposition, so to speak, and I hate that terminology, but it fits here, the value proposition of data journalism is if we can get 70%, 80% of the value of empirical social science finding, but in 20% of the time, and present it in a kind of engaging way to readers, that's something that's worth pursuing. Now, to break it down even further, to kind of explain some of the principles of data journalism that I'll be pointing out as I talk about the 6 different types of stories of data journalism I found repeatedly came up. These principles include, number 1, that the story leads, and the data follows. Rarely, as in normal storytelling, rarely does data tell a story by itself. And the way we do our job is not to get a data set, kind of find some random finding, and then write about it. That's not how we work, except in rare exceptions. Sports is a good example, and I'll mention that. But by leading with the story and talking to subject matter experts, doing traditional shoe leather reporting, as any journalist would, but then adding an extra layer of original data analysis on top of that, you're letting the story dictate the thesis of the piece, but adding an extra empirical rigor to it. And that's a guiding principle. We want to use rigorous but interpretable methods. For the technical folk in here, what I mean by that is you always want to be as accurate as you can be. You want to be rigorous when it's needed, when it determines the finding. But when explaining that finding to the general public, try to opt for kind of the simplest solution. So what I mean is often we will have models that use, say, sophisticated machine learning algorithms to get to their prediction. But In communicating that result, we may explain it through a more easy to understand kind of a regression analysis approach where there's kind of independent and dependent variables. And you won't always have a mapping one-to-one, but if there's any way that you can have kind of a simple, more intuitive, more explainable description, go for that rather than the more complex one. Also, we just want to be fast. We want to be accurate. We want to provide news readers with good information. And something I'm very proud about, and this is a big part of my job as quantitative editor, is being transparent about our data work. One of the things I'm really proud of at FiveThirtyEight, we were, I think, pioneers in putting data and code behind our stories on the web in a very transparent way on GitHub. And you could take that data and point out our flaws. I mean, sometimes we would get corrected by readers of FiveThirtyEight like yourself. Other academics and policymakers would extend our work, do amazing things with it. Students would too. So that transparency that we got through putting our work on GitHub is something I'm going to highlight again. And just one last thing as I'm defining data journalism, I just want to be clear. FiveThirtyEight did not create this. This is old. This has been around for decades. We are not the originators of data journalism. Lots of other great outlets already do it. The Upshot of the New York Times, The Guardian internationally, small websites. I'm pointing out Presidency here because I think they do a good job with data journalism, if you haven't heard of them. And then there's this hilarious and anachronistically named organization called NICAR. It stands for the National Institute of Computer Assisted Reporting. But they do fantastic work, and they've been around for decades. So we're not the genesis of data journalism by any means. All right. I'm going to be mentioning, as I go through the 6 types of data stories, how we use technical tools, mostly R and the tidyverse packages, to get to our findings. Why do data journalists use R? It's kind of the tool of choice at FiveThirtyEight. I see it being adopted in lots of other newsrooms. And for the folks in here who are kind of R coders and interested in how we use R, I will be showing some R code. Not a lot, don't worry for those of you not interested. Not a lot throughout the presentation. But the kind of guiding reasons why we choose this tool are, number one, it's free, it's open source. Hence, if we want to be transparent, we want to allow anybody to be able to run that code and reproduce our results or not for themselves. It has amazing plotting functionality. ggplot2 in particular allows us to make really sophisticated graphics easily. It's just the best in-memory data wrangling tool that I know of. And a lot of the work of a data journalist, like a lot of the work of a data scientist, is unsexy in that you're kind of dealing with ugly data sets and having to tidy them and transform them into a usable setting. We also use R a lot, again, posting through GitHub and through the RStudio projects functionality. For those of you who use it, is really great for collaborating between journalists. And then finally, we prototype some of our interactive data visualizations in R using Shiny. But those are implemented by a wonderful team of visual journalists led by Andre Schenkman, and they tend to use other tools like JavaScript and D3, and they're fantastic. And by the way, I'll be citing all the work of my FiveThirtyEight colleagues. But the bottom line is that we use R because we think it's the best iteratable tool for data analysis. You can kind of rapidly explore a data set and get to some kind of salient message from it fast. That said, there are some users on the staff and everywhere that use Stata and Excel and other tools, Python. And I don't want to be too religious about this because there are other great tools out there. And again, this is our GitHub page. You should check it out. And by our GitHub page, I should say, I ran this for several years, but it's currently being run by others since I've left FiveThirtyEight. It's github.com/FiveThirtyEight/data. You can find the code and data behind FiveThirtyEight stories. All right. One last thing before we get into the heart of the presentation. I want to give great credit to Chester because along with some other colleagues, he developed a FiveThirtyEight R package, which you can download all this data and code from our stories directly into your R environment to play with it. It's also being developed, and I'll show you later, as a wonderful tool for teaching statistics. So kudos to them. Check it out. It's on CRAN, the kind of central repository of R packages. Now, the title of this presentation is the 6 types of data journalism stories, but really, I'm not going to make such a pompous claim like these are the canonical 6 types. It's just that repeatedly as a quantitative editor, I saw these types come up again and again. They were clusters, if you will, of stories. Now, as quantitative editor, I was like partly a staff data scientist at FiveThirtyEight, but the other part of it was editing the stories. Not for prose, but for methodology. And when I would do that, I would see stories from freelancers, from other staff members, and over again, you had the kind of similar themes or the similar approaches coming through. What makes a data story worth telling? The kind of motivating principle I found often would boil down to one of these 6. Novelty, outlier, archetype, trend, debunking, and forecast. Now, as I go through each of these 6 types, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk and show examples of FiveThirtyEight stories that represent that type, but I'm also going to give you a danger, a kind of warning that there's a cognitive pit that you can fall into if you think that this is the data story you want to tell, and you can make mistakes from that. So there will be a danger. There will also be a tactic, a piece of advice I'll give you on a good approach to telling that data story. And then finally, a kind of guiding question to have in your mind as you approach that story. Why do I give you a danger and a tactic to avoid these cognitive pitfalls? Well, this is a great TED Talk by the economist Tyler Cowen called Be Suspicious of Stories. It's not to reject fiction or literature by any means. Stories are important. They're the main vehicles of communication between humans, I'd argue. And he argues, but he says to be suspicious of stories because a lot of evidence in cognitive psychology tells us that we can hone in and find a story, a data mine it, so to speak, that fits our preconceived narrative. And to be suspicious of the easily believable stories that you hear and that kind of click for you, to check them out one step further, and that's where data comes in. I think that's where empiricism is important. All right, let's get started. So, first type of data story is novelty. A novelty data story is because the data itself is the story. I mean, this is the exception that proves the rule, but when there's either a never-before-seen data set or a data set that your reader is presumed not to have seen, this is the type of data story you might tell. Here's an example. In New York City in 2015, there was a debate between the de Blasio administration and Uber, the ride-hailing app. We didn't know how Uber affected the yellow and green taxis in New York. Well, we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Taxi and Limousine Commission, the TLC of New York City, to get data on Uber pickups. So we told a story about it. And one of the things we found in this story, and this is massive data in terms of size, it's 4.5 million pickups in 2014, and then 14 million in 2015. These are the lat-long coordinates of Uber pickups and the time of day. So what we found, and this is a map on the right side here that shows relative to taxis, Uber had a point in their public arguments with the de Blasio administration that they did serve kind of outer borough areas of New York City more frequently than taxis did. So, all right, that's interesting. But how did we approach our data storytelling here? The reason this was worth telling is because this data had never seen the light of day before. We had to FOIA it, okay? So as we approach other stories, this is just the first one we wrote following the FOIA data. We were conservative in our approach, and that's kind of one of the tactics or pieces of advice I'll give you with telling a new data story. So here's a subsequent story we wrote. It's about how, this may seem obvious now, but at the time the de Blasio administration was spending millions of dollars to consultants to determine this. But we found that Uber was displacing taxis in the areas of New York City they were operating in. Now, again, the danger with telling these types of novelty data stories, is that it's trivial, that it's kind of a who cares, so what takeaway. And frankly, you see this a lot in the business press. You see it, there was a new GDP report or a new personal income or industrial production number, and here's the number. And it doesn't have any kind of meaning or any kind of context to it. And it just kind of just feels like it's new for the sake of being new, but it's not that impactful. So to keep in mind, this question of, is this data meaningful to others, not just you, the beat reporter, you, the student or researcher, is it meaningful to others? Just because it's new, it doesn't mean that it's worth telling. Now, the tactic, in addition to being conservative with data, new data, is to just do what we did here, which is just plot the simple summaries of the data, to EDA, exploratory data analysis, map the data, visualize it, to get a simple understanding. If it's new, there could be errors in it. There could be kind of idiosyncratic relationships you weren't aware of before. So to just kind of approach new data sets with simple summaries at the beginning is a smart tactic. So here's some other examples of kind of new data stories. This was a story using global terrorism database data. This is a database of global terrorism attacks and other information about those attacks, injuries, fatalities, other metadata about the attack. And I wrote the story. It basically shows you how in 2015, this is the most recent data available, total attacks declined, but actually not in the West. In North America and in Western Europe, they increased slightly. But in the areas where there's the predominant number of attacks, they declined. Again, these are simple summaries. There's nothing sophisticated about this. But because this data set wasn't really getting much attention until 2014 and after, where it really got kind of sophisticated and cleaned up so that other users could write about it, it's best to stick with a kind of simple summary approach, we thought. Similar here, and I told you I wouldn't mention Trump that much, but I will be mentioning Trump occasionally. This is some simple scatter plots we did with county-level demographic data, looking at how Trump under or overperformed Romney in 2012. And what are the demographic characteristics of the counties that Trump did better than Romney in? And they tended to be older counties, whiter counties, counties with less education. Yep, there they are. All right, so that's the kind of novelty data story. But moving on to I think the most important, the most common by far data story, because it's irresistible. It's an outlier. The best, the worst, the greatest team ever, the poorest town in America. These outlier stories hold natural fascination for anybody, right? And they're kind of the bread and butter of data journalism, really. But because they're so irresistible, they have some traps, too. Here's two examples from sports. These stories both come from my colleague, Ben Morse. On the left, in 2014, he wrote a story. On the right, in 2014, he wrote a story about Lionel Messi. Just how he was by far the best footballer or soccer player in the world. And you see, okay, this is clearly an outlier. There's really two outliers, Ronaldo as well. But this is showing shot attempts and then goals scored. Okay, who's that? It's Messi. Who is this person? How are they so much better than everyone else? It's an outlier story. It's naturally fascinating. And on the left, this has been a story more recently about Steph Curry, the basketball player, how he's just the best shooter in the NBA, beyond anyone else, both in his number of shot attempts, but also in this regression model where Ben estimated the expected points added, where he took into account the defender's location, when a player took a shot, the time on the shot clock, and other variables. So we have here sports outliers. That's naturally fascinating. Here's a political example. In Kentucky, this county, Elliott County, for about 150 years voted for the Democratic presidential nominee until it didn't. Last year it voted for Donald Trump, but it had the longest streak of voting for a nominee of any one party. So that's kind of unusual and an outlier among counties or places in the U.S. So my friend Ruben Fisher-Baum wrote this piece and explored why. Another one, what are the most lucrative college majors? This is done by my colleague Ben Castleman. It's going to be a little dispiriting for some of these read folks because they're all in engineering. And I think that this is, Ben gets into how the kind of initial salary you get from a major out of college is maybe misleading because your lifelong income growth is different if you have a liberal arts education. But in terms of the economic guide to picking a major, Ben did this analysis, and I think importantly for the R users here, posted all the reproducible code to do it in R on our GitHub account. This uses, I think, American Community Survey data. I'm just showing you a snippet of it right now. And people have taken this and extended it to kind of really kind of stress test this kind of relationship between majors and income. So what's the danger of an outlier story? It's that it's not really an outlier. It's that it's just a spurious result, and maybe it's due to randomness or due to some omitted variable bias in your analysis. You think you have an outlier, but you don't really. But what's the vehicle through which you can tell these stories? What's the tactic? It's pretty obvious. It's to use characters, right? Storytelling relies on characters as the kind of vehicle to express the motive of your story. And I think in Outliers, it's obvious to write about that county, that major, that player. So keep in mind, to make sure it's not a spurious result, and ask yourself, is this really that different? Are these outliers really outliers, or are they missing some kind of further step in my analysis that I made a mistake in? So here's another example of an outlier story. Police residency requirements. I wrote this story. This is a story in 2014. After the unrest in Ferguson, there were calls for police residency requirements as maybe a mechanism to encourage police departments to hire people who are more representative of the communities they serve. So we made this, we did this analysis and ranked the least and most representative police departments in America among the 75 largest cities. You see here that there's an outlier in New Jersey for those two cities. What we highlighted, and you see them highlighted horizontally in gray, are these major cities that had police residency requirements. And was there a relationship between instituting one and whether the demographic composition of the police force matched the community better later? Turns out there wasn't, and there's good reasons for that in terms of the experts who really know this. It deals with recruitment and police officer civil service exams to hire them. But the important point with a story like this, we can do the data analysis, we can write about an outlier, but as with anything in data journalism, it's not different than normal journalism. You need to talk to a subject matter expert. And so speaking to sociologists, criminologists, people who really know this, helped inform this piece. It's also a well-reported piece that my co-author did most of the reporting on. So Batya Ugarsan is the co-author on this piece with me. Here's another example. This is a great example of using characters to tell an outlier story. The gentleman on your right here, his name is Kenny McKenna, and he lives in Wyoming. This is a story my colleague Anna Marie Berry Jester wrote about Wyoming suicides. Kenny tried to take his own life. He's since gone through therapy to kind of get over his trouble with mental illness. But the story Anna wrote used Kenny as a character to tell a broader data-driven narrative, which is this. It seems that, and this is part, by the way, of a gun deaths in America project that FiveThirtyEight did last summer. It seems that gun suicides, unbeknownst to I think most people, are a huge part of all gun deaths in America, and that they're not equally distributed. In some of the western mountain states that have a high rate of firearm ownership, gun suicide, unsurprisingly, has higher rates there. Among age groups, it's not evenly distributed, or among sex. Men, particularly middle-aged men, have far higher rates of gun suicide. And then it's predominantly clustered among white middle-aged men. And so she profiled Kenny in Wyoming. It was a data-driven story in the sense that there was lots of analysis to kind of determine where the reporting should take place. But his story, and it's beautifully written, and I encourage you to read it, is the kind of driving factor that uses, again, he's the character that pulls you in, even though the story is rigorously backed by data. And Outliers itself, I don't actually like this book, but to just drive home the point, the outlier data story is irresistible. Third type is an archetype. It's kind of the complement to an outlier, right? I struggle with names here, but another way to think of this is the most common case. What's the most typical example of something? Using data to pinpoint, hey, this is just a typical case of something, and to then explore it. It's kind of a complement to the outlier approach. So here's an example. This is a story my friend and colleague Ben Castleman wrote around the time of Ferguson as well. It has to do with looking at racial economic inequality. this is data from the American Community Survey, which comes from the Census Bureau, on the ratio between black and white earnings and or median income, and the household median income overall in that area. And the takeaway from this analysis, as tempting as it is to write, and journalists did this in the wake of the Ferguson news, that Ferguson was an outlier in that kind of sense of racial economic inequality, Ben finds, and through his reporting backs up, that it's not. That like this is actually pretty common in America, that many, many towns in America have this stratified racial economic inequality. And so it's not poorer or any more unequal than many other places. So there's other explanations for why it happened in Ferguson, dealing with the police force and so on. But that this could happen anywhere, that we have bigger problems to deal with, systemic problems, I think is a big takeaway of Ben's piece. So when you're doing the archetype story of something, what's the most typical of it? The approach I recommend is really rigorous modeling, because unlike the first example where you're writing a story about new data, in this, you're really making a case that this is the most typical form. And to kind of have a kind of a rigorous model underpinning it is crucial. And the danger you have when building that model, I think, is just oversimplifying, omitted variable bias, not taking into account factors that maybe just weren't front of mind for you. So to ask yourself repeatedly, what variables am I using? Am I using the right variables? Am I speaking to the right subject matter experts to kind of take in all the context to this problem before I say this is a most common, an archetypal case? Other examples. Okay, so this is a quote I love, attributed supposedly to Albert Einstein. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So that's the kind of motivation behind not oversimplifying your archetype stories. And then there's another quote, actually, even though this is a lot of R people here. In Python, the programming language, there's a Zen of Python, and there's a few lines in it where that goes. Simple is better than complex, and complex is better than complicated. So that kind of motivating reasoning is important. Here's another example of a kind of an archetype. What's the most common name in America? I did this story with my ex-colleague, Mona Chalabi. And what we found was, we thought it was going to be a simple story. This is again, an example of not to oversimplify. We thought, okay, let's look at surnames data from the Social Security Administration. These are the baby names data sets that you see on the internet, right? Let's look at the surnames of the most common surnames in America, the most common first names in America, and then from the U.S. Census Bureau, let's look at the most common surnames, match the two together, and voila. Well, it's not so simple. So, first of all, it's kind of interesting on the left here for the baby names that I don't know why, but parents tend to be much more conservative in naming their sons than their daughters. So you see that like the most common names tend to be predominantly male names. Anyway, that's interesting. So we thought, hey, Michael is the most common first name in America, and Smith is the most common surname in America. So the most common name must be Michael Smith. Well, I mean, thinking a little harder for a minute, you question, well, is there a perfect correlation between first names and surnames? And of course there's not. So we looked at data from where? The Yellow Pages, the phone book. This is a correlation matrix of first names and last names. In red, names are negatively correlated. In blue, they're positively correlated. So you have something like, let me give you a good example. Michael Smith is a good example of a negatively correlated name. Or John Smith, John Smith is a good example of a negatively correlated name. But you see here in the right side all this red. Well, what's that? It's Hispanic or Latino surnames. Garcia, Martinez, Rodriguez. Well, this is a big part of our analysis that we had to correct to not oversimplify our model. So what we did was we essentially looked at this correlation matrix and try to adjust the totals of specific surnames in America based upon the population of Hispanic or Latino individuals in that area, using census information on immigration, both legal and undocumented. immigration. And what we found was that we had to have these kind of name Hispanic or Latino correction coefficients for names, predominantly those names that showed up. And Maria Garcia is a great example of this, where Maria Garcia, if you assumed just normal correlation between the frequency of the first name and the last name, it would be something like the 350th most common name in America. But when you realize that there's just a much higher frequency between the first name and the last name, it's the 7th most common name in America. So again, looking at the kind of most typical cases, and all this data is on GitHub as well, and is a good example of using R in the context. So that's the archetype motivation. The fourth example is trend. And this you see this a lot too, especially in the business press. It's a time series argument. Something's getting bigger, or something's getting smaller. Like, for example, manufacturing jobs are declining in America, or contingent part-time gig economy work is increasing in America. These stories are really fraught with a lot of complications. So I'll give you an example here. In breaking news, and this happened in November of 2015 after the Paris terrorist attacks. In breaking news, there's a tendency among traditional journalists, but sometimes data journalists too, to maybe oversell any kind of small inference you have, any kind of data you have about this incident, and turn it around quickly to make some sensationalist claim. Now, what we use when there's a kind of a terrible incident, like a terrorist attack or any kind of violent murder, for example, we want to contextualize it over time. Just because we feel like that's the kind of most agnostic, simple thing we can do to see if rates of this are declining or increasing, but being careful not to make kind of any causal claims. So, along with my colleague Carl Bialik, we wrote this story overnight, looking at terrorist deaths in France and the EU, showing that they had been declining, actually, over time. Terrorist deaths had been declining in France, but there was a rise in specific terrorist attacks and terrorist deaths due to religiously inspired terrorism in France and in the EU. I show here some of our code here because I mentioned this earlier for the R folks in the audience. Our preferred tools of choice are not just R, but the R tidyverse paradigm promoted and created really by Hadley Wickham in particular. And the main reason I want to emphasize this code is readability. The kind of piping, the ability to kind of clearly explain and document your explanation, especially when you're working on deadline, is crucial. So, okay, I say trend stories or time series stories are fraught, so my advice is to be conservative, to kind of refrain from drawing any kind of grand causal explanation from it, because what's the danger? The danger is that this time isn't different, that this trend that you've found is really just variance. It's just noise. There's no signal. Let's go through some other examples. This is also a breaking news event, again with a kind of analogous motivation, to just provide historical context on police officer deaths in the line of duty. This happened after the Dallas police shootings last summer. We looked at deaths of police officers in the line of duty from this amazing database called the Officer Down Memorial Page, which tracks police officer deaths actually going back to the late 1700s, which is hard to believe, but they have that data. And again, with the readability, here's some of the examples here of using RVest for web scraping and the tidyverse for piping. But we looked and basically found that the Dallas shooting was really an outlier, and in a way that you could justify with this historical data. Another example of time series trends is the national parks and their popularity over time. This is a story I wrote last summer tied to the centennial of the National Park Service, showing how visitation to U.S. national parks has been going through the roof. Even, if you adjust for population, it's still been increasing dramatically over the long term. But the popularity of specific national parks, of course, hasn't stayed constant. And so we were able to create these graphics here on the right showing individual national parks. So Grand Canyon is number 2, Great Smoky Mountains is number 1, and you see kind of some of the others up there, Rocky Mountain, Yosemite, and so on. This is a fun story, just kind of outlining the popularity over time. And I highlight the story because the graph on the right, again, due to our amazing visual journalist team, this was done by Ella Cozy, but others on that team do wonderful work. They take this kind of base R or base ggplot chart on the left, We apply a custom 538 theme to it, and then they use their skills with Adobe Illustrator to kind of annotate and clearly explain our graphics, and I think that's one of the things that makes 538 so distinctive. So Andre Scheinkman and his team are amazing and deserve credit for that. So that's a trend story too, and there's the Grand Canyon, my favorite national park. Debunking is the fifth type of data story, data journalism story. And this is maybe too fun to write. I think that's part of the problem, to kind of rebuttal and to kind of get your blood boiling, to work up and kind of say, no, you're wrong, and to say it with data is fun, but it can also lead you astray. So debunking is basically using data to disprove a common a misconception and to point out with data how it's wrong. So this is one of my favorite stories 538 has ever done by my colleague Walt Hickey. It's about Hollywood's discrimination against women. And it uses this tool, this test called the Bechdel test, developed by Alison Bechdel, a cartoonist and multi-talented person all around. And the Bechdel test is really three parts. Number one, in a movie, in a film, in a book, whatever medium, but this was about film, you have a three-part test for the Bechdel test. One, are there two or more women? Number two, do they talk to each other? And number three, do they talk to each other about something other than men? And you can classify whether movies pass or fail the Bechdel test over time. And this is the cool data set developed by BechdelTest.com. And so initially you see, okay, more movies are passing the Bechdel test in the sense that they're giving just representation of women potentially in the movies, at least not grossly unjust representation of women in their movies by not having many women or not having them talk to each other, or not having them talk to each other about other topics than men. So that's the starting point that Walt had. But what we did, though, is we looked at those movies that passed the Bechdel test and tested their box office performance relative to their budgets. And again, this is data that we put on GitHub. And this is a great example of someone actually taking this data and then extending it and making a really cool feature out of it. And that's something I'd like to show you here. The person who did this is actually Chester and his colleagues. So this is our studio, for those of you who aren't familiar. And I'm just going to show you real quick what Chester and his colleagues have done with the 538 R package. Once you load the package here, you can examine vignettes of 538 stories and the data behind them. So this is all done by Albert Kim, Chester, and Jennifer Chun of Seattle University, and it walks you through the data and code behind the story and how you can reproduce this, dispute it, criticize it, extend it, whatever, through your R code. So it tidyversifies, so to speak, if you know what I'm talking about that. The tidyverse packages in R, it makes this code a lot more elegant, so that's to Chester's credit. And it walks you through, again, how to determine the median return on investment of movies that pass the Bechdel test versus those that don't, and showing that basically they have a higher median ROI, the movies that pass and fail, and so on. And there's many different types of many different ways you can examine this data, but the point is that you can do it for yourself in that the 538 package is a great way of using our data to either teach statistics or to examine a research project and extend it further. So with any kind of debunking story, and this story did debunk the kind of misconception in Hollywood that, well, movies that don't pass the Bechdel test are made because, if we made a movie with too many women characters, it wouldn't make any money. And this analysis proves that that's not the case. So that's the kind of debunking. That's the misconception that was overturned. But the problem with these types of stories is that you're your own worst enemy. that your own confirmation bias, and this harkens back to the point from Tyler Cowen about being suspicious of stories, to kind of checking yourself, to being skeptical about your own priors going into an empirical analysis, almost writing them down and being explicit about what I think the results should be, honestly, and then trying to do the analysis impartially, I think is just a good exercise. But my example of how to do this well, a tactic, piece of advice, is to actually look at, if you think you've debunked something rigorously, to look at the other person or the other conception's failures, and to showcase those failures, to examine them. Because I think oftentimes when you think you've debunked something, it's either miscoded data, omitted variable bias. It's something else that you would easily find if you just looked at the data points and examined the ones that you think supposedly are case studies, examples that overturn the misconception. So just ask that, like, constantly to yourself, how much do I really want to debunk this, and does the data really back it up? Here's another fun debunking story I was a part of with my colleague, Christy Ashwandon. She's our science writer at FiveThirtyEight, and she wrote a story basically about how nutrition studies are bullshit. That a lot of studies about what you should eat and how it affects your diet are just based upon ridiculously low sample sizes of I'm talking 30, 40 people, that I think statisticians in this room I see cringing, and they draw inferences from that about, oh, if you follow this diet, you'll have a good outcome. But her story, which was reported using, talking to nutrition experts, but also talking to statisticians who've been critical of these studies, this story, besides her reporting, was supplemented by a very fun exercise, which is we ran a survey of about 40 people, asked them to record what they ate over a few weeks, took their demographic information and other kind of ancillary, ridiculous characteristics from their life, and then we ran thousands and thousands of regressions to find p-values below 0.5 to then justify, as some of these nutrition studies do, ridiculous correlations, like between eating cabbage and having an any belly button, between having egg rolls or liking egg rolls and owning a dog, and between liking potato chips and doing well in math SAT section. So, I mean, the point of this was, and I'm pointing out, this is our GitHub repo where we kind of say, this is evil statistical work, like, don't do this. Like, you need a Bonferroni correction, you need to just totally rethink your model, you just need to not do thousands of regressions, except in, I don't know, some other scenarios. But if you're trying to have some kind of rigorous inference, this is not the approach to have. So again, debunking a story with data by kind of explaining this phenomenon of p-hacking, of kind of multiple hypothesis testing over and over to find something that you can then report and write a journal article about, but it's actually just randomness, it's spurious. All right, last data story, the most interesting one, I think, forecast. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a certain forecast made by FiveThirtyEight, where the winner on the eve of the event was thought to have about a 30% chance of actually winning, but they did. Talking, of course, about the Alabama-Clemson national championship game, where Alabama, a dominant team, was thought to have about a 70% chance of winning, and Clemson upset them. And this was a forecast we make, by the way, using ELO ratings for college football, for NBA, MLB, NFL. And ELO ratings, if you're unfamiliar, come from chess. It's kind of a fun, it's a simple, transparent way to kind of create power ratings for teams or individuals. But, I'm kidding. I'm going to talk about the election here. Because the problem with making any kind of forecasting data story or any kind of forecast, the most common problem, there's many problems, it's just overfitting your data. It's having a kind of historical or subsample of data that you use to fit a model and then expect those coefficients, that explanatory mechanism to carry over to new data when it won't. Now, my advice and tactics that I've learned from others, namely Nate Silver, the founder and editor-in-chief, is to use simulations and graphics really and scenario planning to explain forecast. And the reason I bring up Alabama and Clemson before I talk about Clinton and Trump here is that I think sports fans tend to get the idea of probabilities and upsets a lot better than political aficionados do. And maybe that's not fair to point that out because sporting events happen more frequently versus, say, elections are rare, or they're less frequent. So people get that, Alabama's a favorite, and they get upset. That doesn't mean that the 538 model or any model is not, wrong. I mean, there could be flaws to this. I'm not dismissing those, but my suggestion and the piece of advice when writing about any forecast story is to use scenarios and simulations to explain them. So this is an example. It's not on the eve of the election. Nate wrote this on October 21st, just about 2 weeks before the election. And I think it's just an amazing graphic of how to explain a forecast. Richie King and some others on the graphics team made this. It's showing the distribution of the popular vote margin on the x-axis and the probability of any of these events occurring, and kind of colors them according to 4 different scenarios. And actually the scenarios of Trump winning rose a lot just because after the Comey letter, polls tightened a little bit in the few weeks before the election. But I use this from October 21st to just illustrate a point. Use simulations to explain a forecast, and what you find here is when Nate wrote this piece, he said, there's basically 4 scenarios. There's a Clinton blowout, a Clinton win in the kind of Obama zone, a very good win, and then a narrow Clinton win is a 3rd scenario, and then a narrow Trump win is a 4th scenario. Again, this is not to abscond, to evade responsibility for any kind of flaws in, say, polling data that are inputs to the model or the actual construction of the model. And all this, by the way, goes to Nate's credit, and I'm not the expert to really speak on it in specifics, but his writing in the wake of the election, I think, has really kind of explored these topics of what is rigorous model building exactly, and with election data, what are the flaws with polling that you should be aware of. But this kind of tactic I present to you of using simulations and scenarios is a great tactic when talking about forecast data stories and conveying uncertainty in a model. So I conclude here with this slide. This is the main takeaway. I'm not saying these are the only 6 types of data stories that exist. I just repeatedly saw them in my experience editing and writing stories with data over several years. And they all have specific dangers. So for the novelty story, it's that it's trivial, that it doesn't really mean much. For the outlier story, it's that it's spurious and that you need to examine your model better. For the archetype, it's that you've had omitted variable bias, you're not doing enough rigorous modeling to pinpoint the most common case. For the trend story, it's again that it's not that different, that the time series is just variance and that you're picking up on a noise. For the debunking approach to data and argumentation, again, confirmation bias is front and center. And then finally, for that forecast, for that model building to make predictions of the future, the biggest common pitfall is overfitting your model. That's what I mean by data journalism and the 6 types of data stories that you can tell. And that's why, again, I tie this back to effective data storytelling. Effective data journalism is really just using good principles from data storytelling. Thank you.